David, I am so happy to see you again.
Again?
The key word is again, and I will be hopefully seeing you soon in several months again in Ukraine. What's different? You are here already for 3 years of war, regularly coming. What changed, if anything?
Oh, I think a lot has changed. I think people are grimmer. They're maybe, I don't know if they're pessimistic, but they're certainly, people seem to me to be now reconciled to a very bad time for a long time. And that seems worse. I mean, when I first came here, which was in April of 22, and certainly for the first year, probably until the disaster of the second counteroffensive, I think people would, you'd hear all the time people saying to the victory, etc. And now that's a phrase you hear on trains over the loudspeaker, but it's not a phrase you hear in a cafe or a restaurant. I think, look, I mean, I'm a foreigner and I don't speak either Ukrainian or Russian, so what I know is refracted through English or French-speaking people, and what I can just look at and see, and you don't need a language to understand. But it seems to me that what the shock, there's a shock here that I think gets worse and worse, which is why aren't you being rescued? My mother in the Bosnian War did a production of Beckett's play Waiting for Godot, and obviously the sense of doing that production in Sarajevo in '94, I guess it was, when it was besieged, was waiting for the intervention. And I think people have a bigger sense of being on their own. And then, of course, if we're talking about international politics, Trump certainly doesn't help anybody's mental health. It doesn't help Americans' mental health either, but that's another conversation probably. On the other hand, the other thing I would say is that it seems to me that what happened here when the full-scale invasion took place was a lot of political and cultural divisions in this country were put on hold. Not deleted, but put on hold. And you can't do that indefinitely. Sooner or later, those divisions, which were profound divisions, regional divisions, linguistic divisions, questions of corruption, questions of influence, geography, etc. You can't expect them to be in a state of suspended animation like Cinderella waiting for like Sleeping Beauty, waiting for the prince being victory, to come and kiss you and wake you up, and then you can go back to this. It doesn't work that way. Eventually people are going to go back to some of the things that were problematic here before the war and had to do with Ukraine, did not have to do with the Russian Empire. So that's what I see. On the other hand, what I also see is that the cultural flowering, both probably, that I was so struck by when I first came here, is stronger than ever. There are all these good writers, there's all this work being done, there's music, and nobody has stopped doing that. So in the cultural world, or the intellectual world, or academic worlds, the worlds I obviously am more competent to have an opinion about than other worlds, it seems to me things are going, if I dare say it, very well here. And so it's a strange mix, but of course people here live in this state of, you have in Kiev anyway, and in Lviv, and in a few relatively protected, and I emphasize relatively because I'm well aware of all the horrors that have happened in Kiev in the last month. But it seems to me that people get on with their lives until something terrible happens, and then they don't. So that you have, you go to a place like Podil, and if there's no air raid siren, and even if there is, you could be anywhere. And you could be in Krakow. You could be in wherever. I mean, your site, your Easter. You could be in Prague. You're not, except there are no tourists. They're just crazy people like me who come and visit. And as you say, you can't get rid of me now. It's too late for that. So you're all, you Ukrainians, you're stuck with me.
I was coming to the center in the cab this morning, and the driver was Armenian guy from Georgia. There is the district, Armenian district in Tbilisi, capital of Georgia. And he was sharing with me his experience of being, when he was a kid, in Greece, and that he was recognized mainly as a Russian, so ex-Soviet Union person, according to them Russian. Did something change from that perspective for us Ukrainians in the perception of the world? Do people see us as a separate?
Yeah, I think that is changed. Look, the Russian narrative is, it would be stupid to underestimate the Russian cultural and historical narrative, just as it would be stupid to underestimate the Russian military. You shouldn't never underestimate your enemies, but it's a rule of life. You probably should never underestimate anyone, but anyway, that's, again, maybe another conversation. But I think the idea that expressed in Putin's famous speech or essay, or whatever you want to call it, of 2021, where it's "You're one people, the Ukrainians and Belarusians are the sort of baby brothers of the great Russians," and I don't think anyone believes that narrative anymore. I think what you have is I think the narrative that Ukraine has to fight abroad internationally that is more problematic is Russia couldn't be expected to take a power that wanted to be in NATO on its border, et cetera, which is the kind of realist argument against Ukraine that you hear. Also, you hear it from the extreme right and left, both of which are, of course, heavily subsidized by Moscow. But you hear it. I think that narrative is still quite powerful in the West. I don't think the idea that somehow you're really Russians, or this idea that there's this ethnically oppressed minority that's distinct and non-Ukrainian, the Novorossiya argument, if you like. I don't find that. When I'm in Western Europe or in North America, I don't hear many people say that. Maybe their ignorance has served you in some weird way, because maybe the fact that most people don't know anything about Ukraine, I very much include, well, myself, except I'd read a certain number of books before I came here, but I'd been to Western Ukraine twice, and only for a few days each time, and I wasn't thinking about politics. I was actually thinking about poetry in Lviv, and in the mid-90s, I guess, early mid-90s it has to have been, yeah. And but people don't really, I mean, these debates are debates that are alive in the former Soviet empire. I don't think they're alive in Western Europe or North America. I was a lot in Central Asia in the second part of the 90s, in the very beginning of the zeros. And of course I remember all these people who I interacted with, because I was on the board of a subset of the Soros foundations for Central Asia and the Caucasus. But it was much more Central Asia oriented, although I was in Tbilisi and in Yerevan and in Baku. But I remember in Tashkent, in Bishkek, in Dushanbe, etc., being with these Soviet people. I mean, a lot of the guys, of course, had fought in Afghanistan only, less than 20 years before. So, you know, you'd get guys who were younger than me, who were, and they might not be Russians, but they were Soviet people and still, to a great extent, considered themselves that way. But I don't think that was real outside of Russia and maybe a few other neighboring countries. I don't think people thought in those terms. If you think in those terms in, say, the US or in France, you're already an insider. You've already got your opinions, and probably you're pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, whatever it is. These are conversations. This is, to some extent, the problem of any country like Ukraine that's being attacked and trying to explain itself abroad, which it has to do because it needs weapons, it needs money, it needs at least some sympathy. It doesn't need it. Money and weapons are better than sympathy. There was a famous German aphorist of the 18th century, Lichtenberg, who said, "A handful of soldiers is worth a great deal more than a mouthful of arguments." And and so, in order to do that, you Ukrainians have to make, make your case, unfortunately. It's terrible that you have to do it, but you do. But I don't think that what the debates that were inside the USSR, for example, if someone tells you, yes, but Khrushchev should never have given Crimea to Ukraine, let's say, taking an example, any person who's going to tell you that is already inside. Mm-hmm. That's not the general public in France or in the UK or in Italy or in the US or in Canada. That's a person who's already probably chosen their side, probably is pro-Russian for whatever reason, etc. So I don't think that, it was very interesting, for example, to me, that this monstrous creature called Tucker Carlson, who was a TV personality and then became a very successful podcaster, and he was a very hardline pro-Trump guy who's now sort of disappointed because Trump isn't being as pure. And Carlson's extremely pro-Russian, and I imagine has gotten money from the Russians, although I don't know that. He may just be doing it because he's he's just a horrible man. But I suspect he's been well paid. But he was famous long before the war. Anyway, he went to Moscow to interview Putin, and he wanted to talk about all these contemporary things, and Putin wanted to talk about history. And it was completely boring to Carlson. You could see that being told about Rus and, the role of Kiev and whatever, and the Tatars and the this and the that was of absolutely no interest to this guy. And I don't think it's even of interest to. So I don't think I think that war, I don't think that's affecting, I don't think that Russian narrative. There are two Russian narratives that are powerful. The first is Europe you're smaller than they are and you're nearby, and they should have the right to have a government here that they like better rather than worse, which is an old realist imperial argument. It goes back to Thucydides and the famous Melian dialogue. I'm not the first person to say it, but it's essential. So that's one view. And, the other view is just, there are a lot of places in the world that are important to us. Why should Ukraine be so important? And of course, Gaza has had an effect on that conversation in the West. But I think the biggest problem for Ukraine is that Europe can't make up its mind. I mean, the United States has been withdrawing from Europe long before Trump. This isn't, Trump didn't make this up. The United States has been complaining about Europeans not arming themselves sufficiently since at least the Obama administration and probably earlier. And in a certain sense, I think the Europeans are the ones who have to decide that you need to win, or at least not lose any more than you've already lost. And I don't know if they're willing to do that. I was watching the French president's speech, and as you know, I spent a lot of my life in France. I was partly educated there. I taught there for many years in Paris. And I was watching Macron's speech of the other day, 2 days ago. And he talked a lot about Ukraine and how Ukraine was the shield of Europe and that the threat was from Russia and that war was a real possibility, and between France and Russia, basically between Western Europe and Russia. It was a very radical speech, historically speaking. Certainly for a Western European leader, it wouldn't be so radical for a Pole, obviously. But I watched the speech. It was a very good speech. But leaving everything else out, for example, how they're going to pay for all these weapons they say they're going to buy, I thought, well, if you really believe that, you should be funneling everything you've got to Ukraine, because if you had 40 more fighter aircraft, you could shoot down most of the missiles, even assuming there are more missiles coming, and the North Koreans are sending a lot of equipment to the Russian military. But there seems to be some kind of weird disconnect between what these leaders, whether it's Merz or Macron or Starmer, say and what they do. If they really think this is an existential crisis for Europe, they're not responding as you would to an existential crisis. And, it's not an existential crisis for the United States. Let's be serious. I mean, it's an important event that the United States should, in my view, the United States should, in my view, want Ukraine to win and do what needs to be done to help Ukraine win. But it's not, there'll be no Russian army at the gates of the European Union, of the United States, as there will be at the gates of the European Union if the Russians really were to win. And so in the end, that is why I'm, in my view, this is a Brussels debate. I don't want to underestimate what the Europeans have done. For example, as you know, far better than I do, the non-military budget of Ukraine would be absolutely on its knees were it not for the Germans. I don't want to be, I don't want to be rhetorical, but is true that they talk about it as an emergency and then they don't treat it like one.
You said that we should explain ourselves and make the case. If you were Minister of Foreign Affairs in Ukraine, for example,
Please,
or a
no.
president,
Yes.
what would you change in the diplomatic approach now?
Well, look, I don't have to tell you what you already know, which is a lot of the EU ambassadors here feel that the Zelensky government is going after its domestic opponents and not because of war-related reasons. And so one EU ambassador I know said, there's a real problem in the president's office. Now, I'm not competent to have an opinion, and I'm not saying that to duck the question. I simply don't know if this is true, and even if it is true to some extent, like the searching of that journalist's house recently, I can't remember the guy's name, how serious that really is. I mean, this is a country under martial law. One should be a little careful with one's judgment. It's all very well for the ambassador of a peaceful Western European country to talk about civil liberties in an absolutist way, but if that ambassador whom I'm thinking of, his country were under martial law, I doubt they would have been any easier on their opponents than the Zelensky government has been. But I think, I think that history of war shows us that that what you have to control the narrative, and the narrative's escaping Ukraine a little bit now. Whether that's because people are tired, or because of the Trump shock, or just because there are pressures, internal pressures that I don't know about or understand. But for whatever reason, I feel the narrative is slipping away a little bit. So I suppose if I were foreign minister, and then people are inattentive. For example, why was that ambassador to Washington continued for as long as she was? She might have been fine with Biden, but you don't have to be, the second coming of, I don't know, the greatest political thinker in world history to figure out that that she's the wrong person. She's a technocrat, she's an economist, she's not someone who can talk to Trump or to Vance. They need Zelensky, precisely. I mean, Zelensky was amazing. No, but look, having said all these rather difficult things, I should add that given what happened when Zelensky was ambushed in the White House shortly after Trump came into office, no other politician in this country could have restored things. You had to be an actor, precisely. It was precisely all the things people criticize him for. I mean, it reminds me of a joke in a soldier told me once, some frontline place, and he was just, had one drink too many and just come back from the line. Well, this was before you liberated Kherson, and the line was in front of that railroad track, and you'd meet in Mykolaiv. And the guy said, well, all politicians are comedians, but ours is a professional. And I'm sure it's a very old joke in this country. But the point is, with Trump, it's all personal. And you can't that's why, to everyone's astonishment, the Secretary General of NATO, the former Dutch Prime Minister, Rutte, by saying these revolting things, kissing Trump's ring and many other parts of him as well, got what he wanted. Maybe not as much as you need, but a lot more than people thought he was going to get. There was a famous story in French history that Protestant, there was a succession crisis in the 16th century, and they decided to offer the throne, which was then vacant, to the King of Navarre, northern Spain. But the Navarre in those days was Protestant. So in order to take the throne, the King of Navarre had to convert to Catholicism, which he promptly did, and asked to explain himself. He is said to have said, the story may be apocryphal, but I don't know that it is. He said, "Paris is worth a mass." And, calling Trump daddy is, if that's what gets the Patriot batteries to Shesho, and then to hear, call him daddy. And Zelensky understands that, as I think almost no other of the leading figures in this country, the rivals, either the people who've already been president, run for president, or Solution, sitting there in London, or a couple of other people. I don't think any of them could have done that. So, having said some negative things, it might be good to add that they, because I know this I don't know it for a fact, but I mean I have reason to believe it's a fact because it was told to me by someone who was in the room, that when Zelensky came back from the disastrous meeting in Washington, and he stopped in Brussels to meet with the various people, von der Leyen and Macron, they all said to him, "You have to figure out a way to patch it up with Trump." But it's all very well for them to say, but I can't think of another politician who could have done it, because Trump is, Trump's a mad king. It's just that he's a successful mad king, so far anyway.
What do you think about cultural diplomacy and all the famous soft powers?
Well, of course it's necessary, but you see, look, there are two different questions. One is, Ukraine, it seems to me, has an interest in simply creating structures for the diffusion, the promulgation, the familiarization of its culture, full stop. There's this culture that's been suppressed, largely in the Ukrainian language, although certainly not only in the Ukrainian language. And the Russian idea, I always say this, and I'm skeptical of some of the more hardline Ukrainianist accounts of Russian culture here. When people tell me, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy are overrated, and if I only could read them in Russian, I would understand that they're really just these hateful screeds. I'm sorry, I don't buy it. Which doesn't mean they aren't also hateful screeds. But the idea that a writer has to be a good person or have the right opinions, great writer, just seems to me pure wishful thinking. And if you leave Ukraine and Russia out of it, just for openers, most male writers for all of history in every country have had the most horrendous views of women. So if we're really going to get on our moral high horse, let's be a little careful here. But, which is not to say I think people should have to read Russian literature. You may need a break. There are examples of this. Wagner is probably the greatest composer of the 20th century. Not late 19th or 20th century. He's, he may be the greatest composer ever, but he's certainly of opera and that sort of stuff. Opera composer, Bach is the greatest composer ever. But there's a joke about that, but we'll do that another time. Jews couldn't listen to Wagner for 40 years. He was actually banned in Israel for a while. And saying he was the greatest composer didn't make it. People couldn't stand it. And I, certainly, I have no quarrel with this cultural martial law that's taking place here for now. What you decide to do after, including about the Russian language, which, isn't quite as simple as some of the nationalist narratives make it out to be, obviously. That's for after the war. For now, that bookshops don't sell books in Russian or people won't read. I don't have a problem with this, but you can't, these are big cultural problems here. Abroad, however, it seems to me that the more straightforward nationalist narrative is correct, which is that in the Russian Empire, but above all in the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian culture in the Ukrainian language was suppressed except when it could be folklorized. So Shevchenko is the poetry of Shevchenko's that was known in those days was the folkloric stuff, not the other stuff. And so it seems to me that there's a task, a duty, a challenge of reconstruction that's as much for Ukraine as it is for foreigners, to have all the Ukrainian writers and poets and translated into French and English and German, etc. And that seems to me something that has a cultural value in and of itself, because it's ridiculous. I mean, when I came here, I'd heard of Shevchenko, and I knew that Gogol or Hohol, however you want me to pronounce it, in this room, his early work is certainly based on Ukrainian work. Whether Dead Souls is or not it wasn't relevant. I mean, I knew that, but there are Ukrainka and a whole bunch of other people I was totally ignorant of. So I think the fact that simply these books exist in the various important European languages is a value in and of itself. Whether this is cultural outreach or not, I don't know. Because let's be honest, the interest in Ukrainian culture is in part not a cultural interest. It's an interest on behalf of the Friends of Ukraine, for Ukraine. This was true in Soviet times. I remember one of the dissident writers telling me that the minute the Soviet Union ended, Americans were going to be much less interested in Russian, he was a Russian poet, in Russian poetry, because the interest wasn't just, there are these excellent poets in Moscow or Leningrad. It was that these are the dissidents. And so these series, you can now get, they're enormous, at least in English. I think in French too, but I'm not certain. But at least in English, enormous translation projects of Ukrainian literature at Harvard, at other places, and even trade mainstream publishers, commercial publishers, are, who wouldn't have touched a book by a Ukrainian author before the full-scale invasion. They're publishing some of them. Again, not enough, but then there's not enough translated in English from every language. I mean, it's not the United States is a very, despite all the Spanish-speaking people, it's a very monolingual culture. I think the outreach is great. I just don't think you should overestimate what it can accomplish. My real view is the best thing, the best kind of outreach is getting people to come here. I mean, I think of my friend Judith Thurman, our friend Judith Thurman, whom you've interviewed on this show and your podcast. and who's my elected sister, and who was pro-Ukrainian from the start. But she only really was able to, she's pro-Ukrainian in a different way now that she's been coming here. And that carries over to the world she lives in New York, where the fact that she's come, because she's not a fundamentally political writer or thinker. I mean, she has interesting views about politics. She's certainly not she's somebody worth listening, but it's not her main concern. And I think the fact that she moves in the circle she moves in, and has been to Ukraine now twice and will come again next year, and I think that sort of outreach is more useful. I've said to a number of people here that they should think about getting their friends to persuade people to come. And it's not good enough to do something like the Lviv Book Forum. I mean, the Lviv Book Forum's great. I'm not criticizing it. But basically, people come in this very privileged way. They're driven across the border with special permission from whatever, I assume the Interior Ministry. They get put up in a hotel in this city that, if it weren't for the funerals, you wouldn't know there was a war on. And then they go home. And that isn't the way it works. I mean, some people are doing this. Look, Volodymyr Yermolenko and Tatiana Harkova at Penn bring people so that the French writer Emmanuel Carrère, who is, I think, probably the most interesting writer, or certainly one of the 2 or 3 most interesting writers in France at the moment. He's been here a number of times, thanks to them, and they do that a fair bit. Sometimes it doesn't work, as with this tragic story with Victoria Melina, which I can't say the behavior of that Colombian writer after exactly fills me with admiration. But I think people have to come. I think you get better and more effective ambassadors if you get people to see the country, by which I don't mean Lviv, much as I like Lviv, but it's not. I mean, you have to hear the air raid sirens. And not everyone's going to be willing to do that. Look, let's be serious. It's not for me to say that. I spent 25 years of my life being a writer and reporter in war zones and zones of humanitarian disaster, as they say, to use the cliche, unsatisfactory cliche. So I'm not a good model. It's not the first time anyone's dropped a bomb on me. And frankly, on a daily basis, Sarajevo was a lot more like Kherson than like Kiev today. Sarajevo during the siege. You never knew when the bomb was going to go off, just as you never know, which grid coordinate in Kherson they're bombing and using, and the FPVs are over.
And speaking about this outreach and people who, you would bring here as effective, future ambassadors, what would be, again, if you would be now the Minister of Foreign Affairs, which are 10 countries where you would focus? Who is really important at this point?
Well, I really would focus on Europe and And also on, you know, what in Russia they call the near abroad. In other words, I mean, why aren't Kazakh intellectuals coming here? To my knowledge, there's never been an effort to do that. I mean, look, I think it's great that there are these projects. The Renaissance Foundation here has these Latin American projects, one of which translates to something like Hold On Ukraine, and has been going on for about 2 years. But in the end, Ukraine is always going to be a secondary question in Colombia or in even in Argentina, which is quite which there are a lot of pro-Ukrainian people. The government is pro-Ukrainian. Unfortunately, there are also a lot of Russians in Argentina. So it's complicated. But I don't think it's ever going to matter enough to make that kind of effort particularly rewarding. If people want to do it, great. But I would be emphasizing places where, in Europe, where pacifist feeling is still very powerful. I'm thinking of Spain in particular, but to some extent in Germany. But Spain, there's a lot, you know, Spain is a country that the experience of fascism really made, certainly most people in the arts and intellectuals, teachers, et cetera, professional people, really allergic to any kind of idea of war. As you saw, the Spanish opted out of the decision by the NATO countries to up their military budgets in a radical way. I mean, I think the focus really should be on Europe, and as I say, what, you know, states also that will be in the Russian crosshairs if they were to be successful here, if they were a horrible thought. And I don't mean the Baltic countries, that's obvious, but you don't need to do any outreach in the Baltic countries. They're the only countries that really do think it's a total existential emergency in the European Union. But but I think that you know, countries that are not unimportant, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, where you don't, I mean, it's too complicated in Georgia, it's probably too complicated in Armenia, but you know, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and these places, they're not unimportant places, and I don't see any effort there. So I guess I would say, you know, the more pacifist countries of the EU, probably would include Italy too, where the intelligentsia is simply anti-war by, really it's hardwired into them, or it feels that way. I mean, I'm in Spain a lot, and I speak the language, and I have a life in the Spanish-speaking world, and function there, and have done for a very long time. And it's hard in Spain, Ukraine. Ukraine has its friends, don't get me wrong. But saying we need to really, you know, this is the European emergency, which after all is what the argument is, it seems to me. So that's what I would do in case, I mean, no one would let me be minister of dog poo, you know, but I mean, it's preposterous, the idea that I would be in government. I'm also the last person. I don't really believe in intellectuals in politics. I think it's a great mistake. I think I've come around to believing in actors in politics, but intellectuals, no.
Memory Institute. Is it in every country? Is it just an invention in Ukraine? And
No.
is it for internal politics or external politics?
Well, I don't know the answer to that because I've been asking that question here. It seemed to me that previously it was supposed to be both about internal politics and external, both outreach and as a context for reconciliation. I'm thinking of Poland, of course. There's a new person who's just come in, what his program is, what he has in mind, whether he's more interested in graves and monuments and names of streets or whether he's interested in international outreach, I don't know. I hope he's interested in both. A lot of countries have this. Certainly France is, all this idea of the duty to remember and all of that, that's a French academic invention. That's where all this thinking, which doesn't mean there hadn't been memorials before this, of course. There have been memorials to a nation suffering since nations started. But I think that, the memory debate in Europe, Western Europe, is very alive. The problem with memory is the old joke, your terrorist is my freedom fighter. And how do you reconcile, as a Canadian philosopher once said, how do you reconcile the solitudes? And I don't know the answer to that, but you have this problem. There's this hole in your relations with Poland called Volyn. And the hardline, more pro-Russian, or at least more anti-Ukrainian faction in Poland, which is sometimes half the country, sometimes a little less at the moment. Unfortunately, one of them is now the new president. These memories are weaponized, but your terrorist is my freedom fighter. There's very little way around that. So the question is, how do you if it's a zero-sum game, then everybody loses. Because nobody is going to be able to impose. You're not going to convince, you're not going to be able to convince the Jewish world that Melnitsky really was basically a patriot. And, yes, he did these crimes, but his role as resisting the Polish Empire was more important. You're just not going to convince people of that. And they, in turn, are not going to, that Jewish world, whatever that world is not going to convince Ukrainians to rename the President's Guard, to rename the street in the hotel where I stay when I'm in Kyiv, take the statue down. It's not going to happen. So what's the modus vivendi is there a modus vivendi that memory can establish, or that thinking through the memory debate? I'm actually, in the fall, when I come back, I'll be here either the very end of September or the very beginning of October again. I'm going to do two talks at Kyiv Mohila Academy, where I'm now teaching formally. They gave me an honorary professorship, and now it turns out I'm an actual professor, which that'll teach them, is my view. I hope they've learned their lesson and are more careful as they give this coming year's honorary professorship to somebody who won't bother them. I'm going to do two talks with the title, What's Memory For? One of which will be very general, and global, and one of which will try to be much more specific to Ukraine. And then there'll be some kind of roundtable where Ukrainian intellectuals and scholars, et cetera, can tell me how full of crap I am. Or hopefully we can have some kind, it'll provoke some kind of conversation. And I'm also interested in the Bikivnia forest, the monument, and why is Babin Yar world famous and Bikivnia unknown? I mean, there's a memory debate for you in a nutshell. I mean, even a lot of people here forget about people outside the Ukrainian diaspora abroad, but I mean, even a lot of people I meet here have never been to Bikivnia. But everyone's either been to Babin Yar or they act as if they've been there, even if they never actually went. It's sort of like going to the Eiffel Tower in Paris. I mean that. I actually mean that in a certain way. It's kind of a coarse joke, but the monument is globally famous, and the government takes visitors there. It doesn't take visitors to Bikivnia. In fact, the only government that takes visitors to Bikivnia is the Polish government, not the Ukrainian government, and only occasionally. But that's also because the site is partly, as you know, maintained by the Polish government. So I think these things need to be debated. Are they the most important things that confront people now? No, of course not. And again, some of these debates are involve change depending on the situation. For example, the whole issue of the Pushkin statues. I mean, I don't know if that was so important before the full-scale invasion, but I understand perfectly well why people want to take them down now, because they weren't put up because the Central Committee loved literature. They were put up to say, you're Russian. And, including a lot of street names for people who never set foot in Ukraine. Russian writers, Russian artists. But for now, I do think there's an interesting question about what you do with memory. There is a successful example here, and that's the cemetery in Lviv, the big cemetery in Lviv, which after all started as a Polish military cemetery of the 1918-19 war. And in 2003 or 4, the Polish presidents met, and a Ukrainian section was added. And so now it's a kind of place of mourning, rather than having been a somewhat triumphant place for the victory of Polish arms in 1919. It sort of belongs to both, and commemorates both and honors both. But of course, that's easier to do because whatever else is going to happen, Poland and Ukraine are not going to war. So in a way, it's been neutralized. It's history, not contemporary, not current affairs. Whereas, unfortunately, Volyn is alive. It can't be. You can't just turn it over to the experts and say, well, yes, these people were killed, but also a lot of Ukrainians were killed by the other side, et cetera, et cetera. It's hard. So, this country is full of literal minefields, alas, but it's also full of intellectual and cultural minefields as well.
You were using the word intellectual a lot of times, and Alexei, when introducing you to me, was saying, oh, David is the greatest intellectual of our times. or something like
kind of
this,
him.
or something
Not
like
true,
that.
but very nice of him to say.
But something like that. So, in your opinion, what is intellectual? How do you, I don't know, smell that this is an intellectual and this is not? It's about what?
Well, it's fundamentally just what it says in the word, which is being interested in the fundamental sense in ideas and their actual role in our world. Because if you can be a scholar without being an intellectual. You can just be interested in the history of these ideas, the history of the idea of freedom, for example, which is a subject that many, many academics, at least in the English-speaking world, have written about, including an important historian called Orlando Patterson, who wrote a magisterial book on the subject about 40 years ago. So you don't have to be, you can be, as I say, you can be a scholar without being an intellectual. I think what an intellectual does is be focused on ideas, both, they can be political ideas, they usually are political and social ideas, but they can be more cultural ideas. And then tries to understand their importance now. How did we get here? I mean, I've written a lot of books, and I've said this before, I hope I haven't said it on your podcast, but forgive me if I have, it's old age. I don't know what use intellectuals are. I think they can be useful. But I think they're also a class. Look, I mean, there's also a sort of straightforward, doesn't have to be Marxist, it can be a Weberian analysis. There's a class of people who do this kind of work. And that's but you know, partly it's how you deal with ideas in our world and what to make of them and how they're used and abused. What I was going to say about, you know, what I've said, I fear I may have said this on your podcast, but I'll say it again, which is I've got lots of opinions, and too many actually. I'm trying to have fewer opinions. It's good exercise. Although, you know, there's a great Zen line, which I always keep in mind, which is, enlightenment is the greatest disappointment of all. Which seems to me fundamentally true. But what interests me as an intellectual, and I think what interests many intellectuals, is understanding why people think what they do, how we got here, how we should understand the ideas in the world, because the world is material, but the world is also spiritual and intellectual, and one would be making a great mistake. It's the great mistake of actually existing communism, as as leftists like to call it, i.e. communism. You know, to think that somehow the material, that the intellectual and the cultural are just superstructure and the base is always material. I think that's another aspect of the wishful thinking that communism is. It's strange to think that a doctrine as murderous as communism contains so much wishful thinking, but somehow the two are reconciled.
You as well used the word which was a lot when I was a kid used, and then I haven't heard it for a while. You said intelligentsia.
Yeah, well, the intelligentsia are a class, and in that the analysis is correct. I mean, they're the information people. They do the cultural work. And that can be not only can be, that will be increasingly the tech world, because we're entering a world where this new world of AI and all the rest of it, which, you can not like it, but who cares if you don't like it? It's like me saying I don't like it when it rains. So what? Still gonna rain. And we still are going to live in this world that probably, it'll take many decades to really settle down, but in which all kinds of things that were assumed. I'll give you a dumb example. The New York Times just sacked a whole bunch of critics of various arts. They just sacked them. Now, some of them were total jerks. And why did they sack them? Because in the days when everyone's got their blog and in their opinion, these critics no longer did what they fundamentally were there to do, which was to be gatekeepers. There are no gatekeepers anymore. When I was a kid in the late Cenozoic, in the United States, there were, 7 or 8 television channels, only 3 national ones, or 4 national ones, and 3 or 4 local ones in most big areas, big cities. There were 5 or 6 newspapers. You got your news basically from the 3 main national television networks, and of course, from the newspaper that you read. And now there are 500 channels, and the young don't even watch television. Television is like, I don't know, it's like the kind of gramophones that you used to have to wind up. It doesn't exist for the young. Even Twitter and, Facebook are starting to look a little, as we say, a little long in the tooth, a little elderly, a little geriatric. If you look at the demographics of it, everyone's on TikTok. And so in that world, having gatekeepers is impossible. And intellectuals are fundamentally gatekeepers, and as a class. So I don't know what role they're going to have. Maybe they'll write code. I don't know. Or they'll censor code, because intellectuals can also be obviously put to use, as anyone who lived in the Soviet Union knows, repressive use. It's very interesting to walk around Kiev, because you have this tradition here of these buildings with these reliefs, these busts of people, famous people who lived there, particularly these buildings where artists and writers lived. And of course, when you go with local people, they tell you how this one was a police informer and that one was an agent of the state and blah, blah, blah. And of course, intellectuals, there's nothing inherently virtuous about being an intellectual. That's what intellectuals sometimes say, but that's just vanity, narcissism.
Let's go into completely different direction. I will try to do something with you the same I did with Judith, but in a slightly different way.
That was great, your interview with Judith, by the way.
I will be asking you about very simple things. And you tell me any story or any association or anything you want to tell me about it.
Oh dear, I didn't know this was a psychoanalytic session.
So the first important thing which I want to ask you about are hats. You are always wearing hats. What about hats and you?
Well, I'm a fop. You wouldn't know it entirely from the way I dress in Kiev, but I'm obsessed with clothes, and I make, I always say compared to me, Imelda Marcos was an amateur. And even when I'm here, lately, I had a medical problem here, as of course you were intimately involved in. Thanks to you, I've managed to get at least part of the way out of it. But even then, I'm ordering things. I see a tie I like on eBay, and I order it. And I must have, I mean, enough clothing. Somebody said, because I've injured myself, I'm going to leave Kiev next week without my suitcase. I'm going to leave it in here and just take my computer and some toiletries and a change of clothes that I'll need to get back to New York. The 3 days it'll take me to get from Kiev to New York via Helm and Warsaw and London. And so somebody said, aren't you, will you miss these clothes? And I told Judith this story and she roared with laughter because, of course, I have enough clothes to to open a museum. So the hats are part of that, and the hats are one of the few things that transfers. I can't bring my suits, and anyway, it's pretentious. I mean, I don't want to be the only guy in a suit, except for the chief concierge in the hotel. And I don't mind it but for example, on airplanes, I'm usually the only person except for the cabin staff who's wearing a tie. And I don't care. I like it. I enjoy it. It's probably also some hideous insecurity, but who cares? So hats, hats are really portable, particularly the ones I bring here, and so I can have a bunch of hats here. And now that I'm leaving a couple of hats, I'll have more here. And probably eventually, I will start wearing suits here, but it's not quite the moment.
Bring me some of your old hats next time. I will wear the one.
Okay.
So the next one, bracelets. I saw you wearing bracelets.
Yeah, ever since I was in my 20s, I've collected. I'm a collector, which is another way of saying I'm a junkie. And I was a junkie briefly, but that's a really long time ago. But I have a junkie's personality, which is to say, a collector's personality, an obsessive. When I do something, I'm very good at giving things up, however, which is why I escaped drugs long ago, because I'm good at getting addicted, but I'm also quite good at getting clean, and so I'm a collector. Now, it must be also said that both my parents were also collectors, and so who knows? 5 centuries from now, it'll turn out it's genetic. It's some sort of tweak in one of your chromosomes that makes you want to buy 12,000 suits. But it would sort of be a relief if that were true, to be honest with you. So right now, I think it's just an example of weakness of character. When I was in my 20s, I started collecting old jewelry from the Native American, a couple of Native American peoples, Navajo and Zuni jewelry from the American Southwest, Arizona and New Mexico, mostly a little bit, and so I've collected them ever since. So I'm never without one of these bracelets and I'm a serious collector. I mean, my collection will go to a museum when I'm gone. It's the real thing. It's not like my clothes that will go to some bundle in Chad or something. So I've been collecting these things since, like 40 years, 45 years. So I'm always with one. And in New York, where my collection is, this whole debate about which one. That's the answer to that question.
Next
And I think they're very beautiful.
Oh, they are indeed. And next one, perfumes, important or not?
Well, my generation, you wore aftershaves, and so for men, it's just a habit. A lot of younger people don't do that. For women, yeah, I think perfume's central.
The whole culture of shaving, all these dangerous things which grandparents were using, or the ordinary things, or is it still important, the whole culture? Because I remember when I was a kid, I was fascinated. No?
Well, at some point, when I was young, I had quite long hair, and then for a long time I had sort of normal hair. And now I have this ridiculous kind of cut that I look like a kid who works in a car repair shop in the Bronx, with the sides shaved. My head shaver broke while I was here, so it's not as neat as it's supposed to be. But, and I just decided enough with hair, and much to the annoyance of, I think, most of my friends. But no, I mean, straight razors, all that sort of stuff, never were. I might, and then in my, later, last 25 years, I have an essential trimmer, and so, I'm the last idiot who should be allowed to have a straight razor in their hands. I mean, if I'm going to commit suicide, I want to do it intentionally. Seems to be the minimum requirement. Sorry, what did you say?
Cigarettes.
Oh gosh, cigarettes. Oh, how
or cigars, or
pipes. How I
whatever.
loved cigarettes. Oh my God.
Did you smoke?
I smoked like a chimney. I started smoking at 15. I was a very strange adolescent and used to travel with two of my peers to really absurdly dangerous and weird places. And I started smoking when I was 15, and I stopped when I was 27, so it was about 12 years. But during that period, I smoked a couple packs a day. I loved it, and I miss it every minute of my waking life. I mean, if I heard that the asteroid were coming, or when I get that, terminal cancer diagnosis, I assure you, first thing I'm going to do is buy a pack of cigarettes. I thought it was the greatest pleasure. As Oscar Wilde said, it's the greatest pleasure of all because it leaves you somewhat unsatisfied. I loved smoking, but I mean, obviously, I was asthmatic as a child, and the last thing I should do is smoke. So I will have to get that terminal cancer diagnosis or hear that the asteroid is days away, at which point, yes, I will go out and buy a pack of Goldwas.
Jewelry. If you would be buying jewelry for a woman, would it be what? Stones or gold or silver or whatever associations you have with any kind of jewelry?
Well, most of the women I've bought jewelry for have had fairly strong tastes themselves, and with jewelry, I think you can influence how a woman dresses, in my experience, but getting her to wear different jewelry from the kind she likes is really an act of folly, in my opinion. And so I usually take my cue. Listen, if it were woman X, it would be emeralds.
Emeralds?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Cards or other gambling things?
I made a little money as a student playing poker. I liked poker a lot when I was very young, but I haven't played in a zillion years. Casinos and all that they don't interest me. I go once in a while. I'm in a city where there's a casino. There's a famous casino in Buenos Aires, and I go to Buenos Aires a lot. So once in a while I go and I lose a couple $100 and then I leave. That's not one of my addictions, gambling. Strangely, I don't know why, but somehow it skipped me.
Carpets.
Carpets. What a strange set of questions. Sure, I'll play this game. Why not? Carpets. When I was in Central Asia a lot, I bought a few nice pieces, and once in Iran in 2000. But I don't look at them or don't know very much about them. As I say, I have a few in my house in New York. I have a couple of good carpets, but it was never a big
thing.
No.
guns or any other
Yeah,
kind
I
of
used to have a
weapons?
lot of guns. Well, my father was one of these guys who, he hunted, by which I mean hunted with a gun, I don't mean a horse. And so I used to go hunting with him, and we didn't get along very well. And so hunting was a good thing to do, because we didn't, it spared us having to talk to each other. And so I hunted a lot until my mid-teens. And then I went on shooting, and for a very long time I shot a lot of skeet and clay pigeon shooting with a shotgun. And for a while I was collecting a few guns that were not necessarily for hunting. Then I decided I didn't want them around, and I sold them to a police officer I know in New York. But I still have a pistol and a shotgun in my house, and I'm still licensed to, do that. So I have a 9mm Beretta, and I have a very menacing looking, but actually not as nearly as menacing as it looks, Italian shotgun, pump action shotgun. I'm afraid of the automatic ones. But yeah, I like guns.
Alcohol, what are your 5 musts to have at home?
Oh, champagne first, second, third, fourth. Maybe fourth and a half. Malt whiskey. Those are the 2 main ones. I could live, if you abolished all other liquor. I mean, I like liquor, I drink too much. There's a old British joke, journalist joke, that there's a technical but not a functional difference between a journalist and an alcoholic. Well, I drink less spirits than I used to, but I still like really good malt whiskeys. But I basically drink champagne and cava and prosecco and all of that, more than anything else. So yeah.
When my grandpa was observing me when I was very, very young, he would usually scold me if I would use lipstick, because in his understanding it was a bit too much and too vulgar. And he would definitely be more happy if I would be in a dress than in jeans, for example. Is there anything like that about you and women?
No, I like the makeup stuff and all of that. But look, women, it's the question, stylish women have their style, and there are lots of versions of being a stylish woman. So I'm not one of those, I don't have I don't have a...
Anything which...
It has to be this or it can't
important.
be that, no.
Gloves or hat or dress or silk or
gloves,
whatever.
what a wonderful idea. When's the last time you saw a woman in gloves? It's a great idea. I mean, outside a sex shop, But it's been a while. I mean, Audrey Hepburn movies, things like that, yeah. It's a nice idea, but I don't think I've ever seen it.
I did in childhood with my grandmother.
That's because you found a chest with all the clothes in it, presumably.
Flowers.
I like flowers when they're around, but I don't have... I love having them when they're there, but I don't buy them regularly, and they're obviously not enough of a necessity for me to do. But when they're around, they cheer me up a lot. But for some reason, I don't buy them. I don't know why.
Markets, flea markets.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I like a lot. Yeah, I like a lot. Particularly in places, obscure places that haven't been picked over, in flea markets in the U.S. or in France. I mean, they're good, but most people you sort of know what you're going to find, and most of the good sellers, they know what they've got, and it's just. But a flea market in a provincial city in Argentina or in Poland or something that I like a lot. Yeah, you can always drag me to a flea market without any trouble.
What was your favorite book when you were a kid?
Gosh. I don't think I had one. There wasn't one book that my mother, for example, loved Jack London's Martin Eden. It was her obsession as a child. And I read a lot as a child, it wasn't that, but I can't remember there being a book that I kept going back to. No, I don't think there was one.
Opera?
I love opera. I go all the time in New York and wherever else I can, including here. I've seen some
Which one is yours the most?
Opera?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I mean, my taste in music is a little bit, I mean, I like 18th century music and before most of all, so I suppose it's Mozart and Handel and all those people who matter the most to me. Although I love Italian opera. And I can't say I love Wagner, but he's so wonderful that I put up with not loving him. I don't know if he's so lovable. But I go to the opera a lot. I love the opera. But I suppose if you talked about which operas, no, it would be, as I say, Mozart, Handel, and even the earlier ones, Monteverdi and really the beginnings of opera that I prefer. But I go to as much as I can. And I've seen a number of operas here in Ukraine since I've been coming. Saw a very good Nabucco here at the Kiev Opera just down the road. I saw Traviata here that I thought was pretty good. And a couple of things in Lviv, I can't remember what they were.
And the last one, what's the reason to come back now? You are coming here already for 3 years. Why again? Why, as you said, we are stuck with you in Ukraine?
It's tragic. Well, I really have come to feel part of this place, which doesn't mean that I think I'm Ukrainian or have any of those sorts of fantasies. I never feel that. In fact, to the contrary, I think of myself as a writer friend of mine used to tease me, and he'd say, you come from an intellectual somewhere, but a geographical and ethnic nowhere. And he wasn't wrong. To some extent, I've spent my life, or at least the second half of my life, as a kind of professional outsider in many different places. But Ukraine, I'm sort of in it for the duration. It's a marriage. I mean, I'm married to this place now, for better or worse, or better and worse, I don't know. I can't imagine not coming here every couple of months. It's not imaginable to me. So, to wait, 6 months before coming again, so I just can't see it. You're all in my head too much when I'm not here. So, you're stuck with me and I'm stuck with you.
Thank you very much. So I see you in a couple of months.
You'll see me in a couple of months.
Room.
You will. Great.